Greetings to everyone. Now let's see Samuel Taylor Coleridge. Coleridge, the Rime of the Ancient Mariner. Samuel Taylor Coleridge, his lifespan was from 1772 to 1834. So here we can see the picture of Samuel Taylor Coleridge, right? English lyrical poet, critic, and philosopher whose lyrical ballads written with Wordsworth started the English Romantic movement in the year 1798. So, although Coleridge's poetic achievement was small in quantity, his metaphysical anxiety, anticipating modern existentialism, has gained him a reputation as an authentic visionary. In Cambridge, Coleridge met the radical future poet laureate Robert Southey, whose lifespan was from 1774 to 1843, right? Who in Cambridge, Coleridge met the radical future poet laureate Robert Southey in 1794. Coleridge moved with him to Bristol to establish a community, but the plan ultimately failed. In 1795, he married the sister of Southey's fiancée, Sarah Fricker, whom he did not really love. So let's see Coleridge and Wordsworth because both of them together published lyrical ballads in 1798 that was the beginning of the Romantic period. So Coleridge's collection poems on various subjects was published in 1796 and in 1797 appeared poems. In the same year, he began the publication of a short-lived liberal political periodical, The Watchman. He started a close friendship with Dorothy and William Wordsworth, one of the most fruitful creative relationships in English literature. From it resulted lyrical ballads, which opened with Coleridge, a rime of the ancient mariner, and ended with Wordsworth's Tintern Abbey. So, two most famous poems of two most famous romantic literature first generation poets. The Rime of the Ancient Mariner from Samuel Taylor Coleridge and Tintern Abbey from William Wordsworth. Okay, the lyrical ballads totally has 23 poems and most of the poems from Wordsworth and only 4 of the poems from Coleridge. The very famous poem, The Rime of the Ancient Mariner, written by Coleridge, published in Lyrical Ballads. That was the first poem in Lyrical Ballads. These poems set a new style by using everyday language and fresh ways of looking at nature. So let's see the Rime of the Ancient Mariner. This 625-line ballad is among his essential works. It tells of a sailor who kills an albatross and for that crime against nature endures terrible punishments. So the whole poem talks about this. The ship upon which the mariner serves is trapped in a frozen sea. An albatross comes to the aid of the ship. It saves everyone and stays with the ship until the mariner shoots it with his crossbow. You can see the images. Ship. You can see the albatross. You can see the image here. The motiveless malignity leads to punishment. And now there came both mist and show, and it grew wondrous cold. and eyes mast high came floating by as green as emerald. So after a ghost ship passes, the crew begin to die, but the mariner is eventually rescued. He knows his penance will continue and he is only a mission for dictating always the one story. So let's see the rhyme of the ancient mariner, the summary of that. The rhyme of the ancient mariner. Originally, the rhyme of the ancient mariner spelling is different from the spelling which he has given here. It's the longest major poem by the English poet Samuel Taylor Coleridge, written in the year 1797-98, published in 1798 in the first edition of Lyrical Ballads. Okay, so modern editions use a revised version printed in 1817 that featured a gloss. Along with other poems and lyrical ballads, it was a signal shift to modern poetry at the beginning of British Romantic literature. So, the rhyme of the ancient mariner relates the experiences of a sailor who has returned from a long sea voyage. The mariner stops a man who is on the way to a wedding ceremony and begins to narrate a story. The wedding guest's reaction turns from bemusement to impatience to fear to fascination as the mariner's story progresses, as can be seen in the language style. Coleridge uses narrative techniques such as personification and repetition to create a sense of danger, the supernatural, or serenity, depending on the mood in different parts of the poem. Though the core essence of the poem is elaborated here, and we can see the summary. An ancient mariner, unnaturally old and skinny, with deeply tanned skin and a glittering eye, stops a wedding guest who is on his way to a wedding reception with two companions. He tries to resist the ancient mariner, who compels him to sit and listen to his awful tale. The ancient mariner tells his tale, largely interrupted, save for the sounds from the wedding reception and the wedding guest fearsome interjections. One day, when he was younger, the ancient mariner set sail with 200 other sailors from his native land. The day was sunny and clear. All were in good cheer until the ship reached the equator. Suddenly, a terrible storm hit and drove the ship southwards into a rime, a strange icy patch of ocean. The towering, echoing rime was bewildering and impenetrable, and also desolate until an albatross appeared out of the mist. No sooner than the sailors fed it did the ice break, and they were able to steer through. As long as the albatross flew alongside the ship and the sailors treated it kindly, a good wind carried them and a mist followed. One day, however, the ancient mariner shot and killed the albatross on impulse. Suddenly, the wind and mist ceased and the ship was stagnant on the ocean. The other sailors alternately blamed the ancient mariner for making the wind die and praised him for making the strange mist disappear. Then things began to go awry. The sun became blindingly hot, and there was no drinkable water amidst the salty ocean, which tossed with terrifying creatures. The sailors went dumb from their thirst and sunburned lips. They hung the albatross around the ancient mariner's neck as a symbol of his sin. After a painful while, a ship appeared on the horizon, and the ancient mariner bit his arm and sucked the blood so he could cry out to the other sailors. The ship was strange, it sailed without wind, and when it crossed in front of the sun, its stark mast seemed to imprison the sun. When the ship neared, the ancient mariner could see that it was a ghost ship manned by death, in the form of a man, and life in death in the form of a beautiful naked woman. They were gambling for the ancient mariner's soul. Life and death won the ancient mariner's soul, and the other sailors were left to death. The sky went black immediately as the ghost ship sped away. Suddenly, all of the sailors cursed the ancient mariner with their eyes and dropped dead on the deck. Their souls zoomed out of their bodies, each taunting the ancient mariner with a sound like that of his crossbow. Their corpses miraculously refused to rot. They stared at him unrelentingly, cursing him with their eyes. The ancient mariner drifted on the ocean in this company, unable to pray. One night, he noticed some beautiful water snakes frolicking at the ship's prow in the icy moonlight. Watching the creatures brought him unprecedented joy, and he blessed them without meaning to. When he was finally able to pray, the albatross fell from his neck and sank into the sea. He could finally sleep and dreamed of water. When he awoke, it was raining, and an awesome thunderstorm began. He drank his fill, and the ship began to sail in lieu of wind. Then the dead sailors suddenly arose and sailed the ship without speaking. They sang heavenly music with the ship's sails continued when they had stopped. Once the ship reached the equator again, the ship jolted, causing the ancient mariner to fall unconscious. In his swoon, he heard two voices discussing his fate. They said he would continue to be punished for killing the albatross, who was loved by a spirit. Then they disappeared. When the ancient mariner awoke, the dead sailors were grouped together, all cursing him with their eyes once again. Suddenly, however, they disappeared as well. The ancient mariner was not relieved because he realized that he was doomed to be haunted by them forever. The wind picked up, and the ancient mariner spotted his native country's shore. Then bright angels appeared, standing over every corpse and waved silently to the shore, serving as beacons to guide the ship home. The ancient mariner was overjoyed to see a pilot, his boy, and a hermit rowing a small boat out to the ship. He planned to ask the hermit to absolve him of his sin. Just as the rescuers reached the ship, it sank suddenly and created a vortex in the water. The rescuers were able to pull the ancient mariner from the water, but brought he was dead. They thought he was dead. When he abruptly came to and began to row the boat, the pilot and pilot's boy lost their minds. The spooked hermit asked the ancient mariner what kind of man he was. It was then that the ancient mariners learned of his curse. He would be destined to tell his tale to others from beginning to end when an agonizing physical urge struck him. After he related his tale to the hermit, he felt normal again. The ancient mariner tells the wedding guest that he wanders from country to country and has a special instinct that tells him to whom he must tell his story. After he tells it, he is temporarily relieved of his agony. The ancient mariner tells the wedding guest that better than any merriment is the company of others in prayer. He says that the best way to become close with God is to respect all of his creatures because he loves them all. Then he vanishes. Instead of joining the wedding reception, the wedding guest walks home stunned. We are told that he awakes the next day sadder and wiser for having heard the ancient mariner's tale. So when you see the images, now the ancient mariner brought and they thought he was dead. You can see the images and understand uh, uh, the summary of the poem, how the pictorial images actually narrates the whole poem. How the albatross, the ancient mariner, how the people hang the dead albatross on his neck. So we can see before we can see the Coleridge and Kant, we can see the in the summary, part one. In the poem's first line, we meet its protagonist, an ancient mariner. He stops one of the three people on their way to a wedding celebration. The leader of the group, the wedding guest, tries to resist being stopped by the strange old man with the long gray beard and glittering eye. He explains that he is on his way to enjoy the wedding merriment. He is the closest living relative to the groom, and the festivities have already begun. Still, the ancient mariner takes his hand and begins his story. The wedding guest has no choice but to sit down on a rock to listen. Right? So, in the second part, the ship sailed northward into the Pacific Ocean. Although the sun shone during the day and the wind remained strong, the mist miles held fast. The other sailors were angry with the ancient mariner for killing the albatross. Right? The most famous lines in the rhyme of the ancient mariner are unquestionably water, water everywhere, nor any drop to drink. In part three, the sailors were trapped in their ship on the windless ocean for some time and eventually became delirious with thirst. One day, the ancient mariner noticed something approaching from the west. As it moved closer, the sailors realized it was a ship, but no one could cry out because their throats were dry and their lips badly sunburned. So, in part three, the poem becomes more fantastical as the spiritual world continues to punish the ancient mariner and his fellow sailors. So in part four, we can see the wedding guest proclaims that he fears the ancient mariner because he is unnaturally skinny, so tanned and wrinkled that he resembles the sand. And part five, after praying, the ancient mariner thanked the Virgin Mary for finally allowing him to sleep. He dreamed that the buckets on the ship were filled with the dew and awoke to the sound of the falling rain. He drank and drank after so many days of thirst and became so lightheaded that he thought he was a ghost. Right? So we can see here in part 6, it opens with the dialogue between the two voices. The first voice, the ancient mariner, says, asks the second voice to remind it what moved the ancient mariner's ship along so fast, and the second voice postulated that the moon must be controlling the ocean. In part 7, we can see the ancient mariner was cheered by the hermit's singing. He admired the way the hermit lived and prayed alone in the woods, but also loved to talk with mariners. Just as the boat reached the ship, a terrible noise came from under the water and the ship sank straight away. So the ancient mariner tells the wedding guests that ever since then, the urge to tell his tale was returned at unpredictable times, and he is in agony until he tells it to someone. He wanders from place to place and has a strange power to single out the person in each location who must hear his tale. Right? So he, as expected things again, go awry for the ancient mariner despite his momentary relief. Though safely in the harbor, the ship is pulled under by a forceful undertow, but the ancient mariner cannot drown since he is doomed to a living death. Okay, so we understand that he is able to hold an audience attention so completely that he can force a man to miss his next of kin's wedding reception. He is capable of forever changing his listeners, but is also the constant victim of his own talent, a skill that torments but never destroys. Okay, we can see Coleridge and Comte disenchanted with the political developments in France. He visited Germany in 1798-99 with Wordsworth, that is Wordsworth and his sister Wordsworth, Dorothy Wordsworth, so given Wordsworth, and became interested in the works of Immanuel Kant. He studied philosophy at Göttingen University and mastered German. In 1799, Coleridge fell in love with Sarah Hutchinson, the sister of Wordsworth's future wife, to whom he devoted his work Dejection and Ode, 1802. During these years, Coleridge also began to compile his notebooks, daily meditations of his life. Suffering from neurologic and rheumatic pains, Coleridge had become addicted to opium, freely prescribed by physicians. In 1804, he sailed to Malta in search of better health. He worked 2 years as secretary to the government of Malta and later traveled through Sicily and Italy, returning them to England. So we can see Coleridge's note. The author continued for about 3 hours in a profound sleep, at least of the external senses, during which time he has the most vivid confidence that he could not have composed less than from 200 to 300 lines. If that indeed can be called the composition in which all the images rose up before him as things with a parallel production of the correspondent expressions, without any sensation or consciousness of effort. On awakening, he appeared to himself to have a distinct recollection of the whole, and taking his pen, ink, and paper, instantly and eagerly wrote down the lines that are here preserved. At this moment, he was unfortunately called out by a person on business from Horlock and detained by him about an hour, and on his return to his room, found to his no small surprise and mortification that though he still retained some vague and dim recollection of the general purport of the vision, yet, with the exception of some 8 or 10 scattered lines and images, all the rest had passed away like the images on the surface of a stream into which a stone has been cast, but alas, without the after restoration of the later. In 1810, Coleridge's friendship with Wordsworth came to crisis, and the two poets never fully returned to the relationship they had earlier. During the following years, Coleridge lived in London on the verge of suicide after a physical and spiritual crisis at Greyhound Inn, but he submitted himself to a series of medical regimes to free himself from opium. He found a permanent harbor in Highgate in the household of Dr. James Gilman and enjoyed almost legendary reputation among the younger romantics. During this time, he rarely left the house. The end of his life. In 1816, the unfinished poems Christabel and Kubla Khan were published, and next year appeared Sibylline Leaves. After 1817, Coleridge devoted himself to theological and politico-sociological works. His final position was that of a romantic, conservative, and Christian radical. He also contributed to several magazines, among them Blackwood's Edinburgh magazine. Coleridge was elected a Fellow of the Royal Society of Literature in 1824. He died in Highgate near London on July 25th, 1834. So, Wordsworth and Coleridge. Wordsworth is clearly more entitled than Coleridge to be considered the leader in creating and also in expounding a new kind of poetry. Until Coleridge met Wordsworth, which was probably in 1795, he wrote in a manner which had been fashionable since the death of Milton, employing without hesitation all those poetic licenses which constituted what he later termed gaudy verse in contempt. If one reads Coleridge's early poems in chronological order, one will perceive that gaudy verse persists till about the middle of 1795 and then quickly yields to the natural style which Wordsworth was practicing. So Coleridge's conversation poems, we can see that Coleridge's shorter meditative conversation poems proved to be the most influential of his work. Conversation poems are poems in which the speaker addresses his lines to a listener within the poem, generally a listener who has little voice of his own. These include both quiet poems like this Lime Tree Bower, My Prison, and Frost at Midnight, and also strongly emotional poems like Dejection and The Pains of Sleep. Wordsworth immediately adopted the model of these poems and used it to compose several of his major poems. Via Wordsworth, the conversation poem became a standard vehicle of English poetic expression and perhaps the most common approach among modern poets. Where we can see the end of the slide and we can also understand Coleridge, the very famous poem, The Rime of the Ancient Mariner.